Okay, I wore this dress the last time I presented, and I should have remembered that there's nowhere to put this, so bear with me. Okay, so in many ways, what I want to talk about today is more basic than where Jose went, but hopefully that will put this in perspective. So bear with me a little bit as we step back and talk about something that I've been thinking about a lot. So I should say I'm a simulation modeler. I build decision support models, but what I want to talk to you about today is a new kind of data, maybe not new, a different kind of data. We've talked about all sorts of wonderful types of data and ways to use data today. So think about this in that way. This is a new way to gather data. I also am going to ad lib a little bit here, which I probably shouldn't do, but I was inspired today by Dr. Wen, who reminded me how pleasurable it is to hear somebody come up, not with slides, and tell stories. So I'm going to do a little bit of this for a minute. I'm hoping that this story, this example, will stick with you and push you to think about how you gather data and what data means to you. Okay, so imagine that this is KHL. I'm Kristen Hassmiller Lich. So this is KHL. This is my news channel, like CNN for me. Okay, there's 3 news stories today. The first is Kristen Hassmiller Lich heard a wonderful, wonderful, and inspirational presentation by Dr. Wen, which got her thinking about storytelling. The second news story was Kristen Hassmiller Lich woke up with a really terrible headache this morning. I heard a couple of you did too, maybe it's the weather. The third news story is Kristen Hassmiller Lich burned her hand on coffee. Okay, so news stories. And I mean we broadly, all of us, in whatever role we are in, academic researchers, policy decision makers, practitioners, we all tend to err on the side of noticing events, my news stories, and calling them out. These catch our attention. But they're a little bit fleeting. They come and they go quickly. What we don't do enough is dig deeper. Okay? So if we dig deeper, what we tend to do next is start to see patterns in the events, look for connections, look for associations. So if you gather data on my events and then maybe the events across other people, we might be able to start to look for patterns. We might speculate, okay? Things like, oh, being inspired was associated with having a headache, okay? We don't know about temporality because who knows if those events were reported in what order? They're all today's news. Maybe being inspired got my adrenaline going. That gave me a headache. Okay? Or maybe I had a headache and that just made me lose focus. So I couldn't multitask, which we all do, and I paid attention to Dr. Wen and was inspired. Right? Who knows what the sort of mechanism is there? Okay? We might also find that if we looked across a lot of different people, there's not much of an association between having a headache and burning oneself. Right? Because that's never happened to me before in the same day. But what I want to encourage you to do is not just look for events, not just look for patterns in events, associations, and I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but bear with me with this simple analogy. I want you to go deeper and think about what's the structure in the system that is leading to this sequence of ripple effects. Because in so doing, we're going to be in a much better position to understand what's going on in the world, why things are happening, and how we can intervene to change them for the better. And so one way to do that is to ask. Ask the right questions. Ask people to talk about dynamics and cause and effect. Ask them to get at the structure, the story, about what it is in the system that's leading to this sequence of events. So if you asked me that, here's what I'd tell you. Okay? I woke up this morning with a headache. Who knows what it was, the weather. Okay, I was staying at a hotel. Maybe that's why I had the headache. New, exposures in the air or weather, whatever. I'm at a hotel. I drank hotel coffee. Not a good way to get my morning started. Okay, caught a bus over here, and I went and I grabbed coffee. But because I wasn't properly caffeinated, it turns out I grabbed decaf. Not very helpful. Okay, so then I come into the first presentation and I listen and I'm feeling, oh, this headache's getting worse. What did I do? Not have enough caffeine is what I did. So I go back outside after the break and I go to grab coffee, which I'm now shaky and desperate to get. Okay, bump somebody, spill coffee all over my hand, right? Okay, so that's how it happened. There's a really good logical story. And in hearing that, you might think about how we could build resilience in this system to keep Christians from burning themselves, right, or hurting themselves. Or it might get us to think about different things we could look for in the data, different patterns of events, maybe headaches and injuries more broadly. Okay? So I guess I just want you to pause and think a little bit about storytelling as a way to capture data, and not just data about events and patterns, but go deeper and try to capture data that involves storytelling about ripple effects to help you understand how systems function. Okay, and I want to talk a little bit about systems and what I mean by that too. So a lot of the presentation that I'm going to make today is inspired by work I've been doing recently. I've been doing a lot of work that seems to involve getting community groups together to address a really hard problem. Okay? All too often, we do stuff like this. Well-intentioned, right? How many of you have heard about, not just intuitively, this idea of collective impact, but the collective impact model or framework? How many have heard about this? Okay. Some, but not as many of you as I'd expect. Okay, so a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is with this National Maternal and Child Health Workforce Development Center. We are working with federally funded public health, the folks in public health departments who are funded through block grants, Title V block grants, to improve the health of maternal and child health populations. And I'm on this systems core. And so what that turns out to mean is that I come in and try to help them. This is workforce development, so I'm trying to give them skills to use to try to study these really hard systems problems, the kinds of problems that they can't tackle on their own. They don't have, their sphere of influence is not big enough, and they just need partners. So they come in with a big systems problem, and we try to help them at the center, help them bring in the right partners and figure out how to begin to get your head around that problem. Get those stories about what it is in the system that's shaping events that we're seeing and outcomes so that we can improve upon them. We want to do something different than this. So we found the collective impact framework to be a really nice way to think about this. The collective impact framework, however, it gives you some guidance on what we need to be able to really meaningfully make a collective impact and how to go about it. So these preconditions, we need to have an urgency for change, and if we don't have that, we need to create it. Storytelling, really helpful here. We also need to have champions, and we need to have enough resources that we can dedicate the thinking space to get people from different sectors, from different parts of the community together to talk about this problem. Then once you bring them together, what should we do? Well, the collective impact framework reminds us that we should try to, instead of having many agendas, all of our different partners, we need to figure out how we can move toward a common agenda. Okay? Rather than having lots of different ways to measure outcomes that we might care about, we need to start figuring out a couple of outcomes that we care about in common and start to measure them in a more shared, consistent way so we can all gauge our success against it. We need to figure out how we can start to have more regular communication integrated over time because these hard problems are not going to be tackled once quickly. We also need to figure out how we can start to do not just these isolated impact initiatives, not things here and there that we think are all working towards some common goal, right, addressing poverty. We need to start really developing a plan for doing mutually reinforcing activities, things that feed off of each other and help us. You know, we want things where 1 + 1 is 3, not 0, where they cancel out. Okay? And we also need a backbone because we know how many of you have been part of collaboratives of some kind that started with all sorts of energy and excitement and then fizzled. Right? That happens so often. So we need a backbone. We need infrastructure to keep this going. And there's all sorts of guidance on what that ought to look like. Love the collective impact framework. But one challenge that we've had is, well, two challenges, but one is, how do you do this? What are the methods? So I want to talk to you about sort of systems thinking and data collection as a potential method to help do this work, to fulfill these principles. Another challenge we have that I've bumped into over and over again with these groups I'm working with is that we're dealing with systems problems. And we've been talking about systems. We've been throwing this word out. And I think a lot of us have different visions that come to our head when we say the word system. As it turns out, with my public health partners and some global partners, when I'd say system, they thought of the immune system, the federal health, the federal government as a system, these really formal systems. Right? Sometimes you can describe the system with an organizational chart. I want to shake it up, and I want you to think about a system a little bit differently. Those are all systems, sure, but so is so say you have a problem that you care about. Okay, I'm going to show you one in a second. It's community violence. Think of a system as all of the factors, all of the forces that come together to shape that outcome over time. Okay, now we're crossing organizational boundaries, and we're talking about some intangible things, tangible things. It's a very different way of thinking about a system. Okay, it can be overwhelming. So one thing I want to do is to encourage you that when you're studying systems and you're trying to understand, gather data on how they behave, focus on a problem, a very specific problem within a system. Don't try to understand the structure of the whole system, at least not at first. It's going to get overwhelming. But if you start by thinking about one specific problem and digging in, it's much more tractable. You can get your head around it, you can quantify it, you can study it, and then you're in a good position to go on and figure out that next problem to attack. So that's a great way to step into this without getting overwhelmed, which is one of the biggest challenges of systems work. So the problem I want to talk about today, just very quickly to illustrate this kind of data collection that I'm encouraging you to think about doing, is a project on community violence. So we were working in Rochester, and I have to mention that I was the methodological support on this project. It is not my content area, so bear with me if I kind of muddle through some of the language. Okay, but we were working in Rochester. In 2014, it was their 50-year anniversary of the 1964 race riots. It also happened at the same time that things in Ferguson were playing out, and all sorts of violence was exploding all over the country. It was a very tense time, an important time to be convening a summit, as they were doing, to get the community to talk about violence. Why are we seeing this? Why are we, and what can we do about it? Okay? So I also want to sort of plant the seed of what I mean by a complex systems problem, a dynamically complex problem. Okay, the kinds of problems that collective impacts initiatives really need to tackle. So what makes a problem complex? You heard some of this from Jose. I'm going to repeat in sort of in my words with another example to hopefully let it sink in. Dynamically complex systems have a number of characteristics which make them really hard to intuit, to get your head around, okay? And also a really hard time to understand just one person. You really need perspectives from across the system to really appreciate it. So here's an example. Community violence has a number of factors crossing socioecological levels that really contribute to it. So this is a system that crosses disciplines, crosses socioecological levels. We've talked about a lot of this today. Employment opportunities, poverty, health, all sorts of things come into play in terms of affecting community violence. And there are dynamics. Dynamics can make systems very complex. So we're talking about adverse childhood experiences. There's great research now that what happens to you as a child really feeds back. It affects what happens to you much later in life, all through your life course, different kinds of events. Okay? Another type of dynamics is violence. There's a lot of different types of violence, and one type of violence can feed into another, predispose you for that other type of violence over the life course. So all sorts of dynamics here make it really hard to get your head around community violence and what to do about it. Feedback loops. You heard Jose talk about feedback loops. Here's an example of one. Okay, so this is system dynamics notation. The way you read this is start anywhere. We'll just start up here with fear, trauma, vulnerability. Okay? And the way we read these diagrams is if two variables are connected, like ripple effects, there's a causal connection, you're going to draw an arrow. And O means that they move in the opposite direction, and S means that they move in the same direction. So if something increases fear, trauma, vulnerability, that's going to lead to a decrease in one's sense of security, which is going to lead to an increase in their personal acceptability of committing violence, which is going to lead to an increase in the likelihood of their committing violence, which puts them in a place where they are also more likely to experience violence, which is going to increase their fear, trauma, and vulnerability. Okay? And the cycle keeps going. So what we see here is a reinforcing loop where violence, once exposed to violence, something triggers an increase in that fear, trauma, and vulnerability. This feedback loop is going to keep churning around and around unless something else intervenes, right, to grow that fear, trauma, and vulnerability and your experience with violence. When we have feedback loops like this, they are very powerful in shaping how that system behaves and things that we want to pay attention to affecting so that we can break that cycle or get it to work in a way that is more desirable for the community. And this, by the way, has been well studied. There's reports that talk about violence transmission, violence contagion. Okay, it's this reinforcing loop. So we had this group in Rochester with a lot of diverse partners that were coming together that wanted to really try to understand. This is where we were right now. This is in 2014, just beginning to understand community violence and how violence begets more violence, and how, this is where they want to go and what we'll be working on this fall, how we can break this cycle and build resilience within the community. So we had all these partners coming together wanting to talk. And there was a really nice sense that it was going to be important. This is a quote from one of the participants from a faith-based organization. There was a nice sense that what was happening, what we were seeing, is a consequence of a number of ripple effects. And that we really needed to pause and talk about it, have these really hard conversations, not just about events or patterns, but the structure in the system that underpins it all, so that we can start to begin to identify better ways to break the cycle, to stop that transmission of violence. Okay, so really, what we were looking for is a way to have that conversation, a way to document the data that we're collecting, the conversation, our hypotheses about how that system's behaving and generating the problem that we wanted to break. Okay, so dynamically complex problems. We bump into this a lot with collective impact initiatives. This is where I've been doing a lot of work lately, is trying to think about how can we get our head around how the system's functioning. There are a lot of methods that we can put in the middle. The one I want to focus on right now, and the one that I just illustrated with the feedback loop, is system dynamics. This grows out of control engineering. It's a good way to think about the world, and how changes ripple through the system so that we can try to improve the way it's functioning. I'll come back to that. So we took some creative liberties in working with the group. This was definitely a process of data collection, conversation that is not conventional, totally conventional, and heavily inspired by system dynamics, but a little bit unconventional, because we knew that this conversation was going to be so racially charged, so hard. But we wanted to really face it head on and get people talking about why and what they see as the mechanisms underlying this violence transition. So we started out with stories, because violence is huge, right? How do you begin to get your head around that? They wanted to start out with storytelling as well. And so we started with a vignette. And you can read this. If you want, you can close your eyes. I'll read it real quick. So we read this vignette out in the group, and then we asked people to reflect on it and we wanted to collect data on what they see as the important structure in the system that was shaping potential violence progression. So the story: your brother and sister come home and discover a robbery is underway. Imagine this is you. Your brother is murdered and your sister is raped, barely escaping with her life by playing dead. The man who did it was caught and brought to trial. You couldn't shake this feeling that the world was unsafe, that bad things would continue to happen. The man is found guilty and sentenced. He is angry, blaming others rather than himself for what transpired. He vows to finish what he started and kill your whole family. That sense of feeling unsafe heightens. Begin sleeping with a gun under your bed. A few months later, you hear a story that the man, while in county jail, stabbed and maybe killed a guard. You can't find out if it's true, but it makes you feel even more unsafe. You fear what might happen if in one of his appeals he is released, or that someone might take up his cause for revenge. That gun is your comfort. You begin traveling with it no matter what the state law for concealed weapons, and you are on edge. So, what we ask people to do is to listen to this vignette and to think about what is the system structure? What in the system could lead to this violence growing, to this violence exploding? And we asked them to brainstorm. And we wanted them to start brainstorming about system structure, about what could lead to what. What was the structure where this scenario, things in this scenario could escalate? We asked them to brainstorm and then vote, and this really guided the conversation. So everybody had clickers, we did a lot of transcribing of what they said. Okay, so we used clickers to try to really guide the conversation, but what we wanted to do is push people to start thinking about dynamics and then go further to really tell that story of the ripple effects, what leads to what, and how, and the whole goal of spending so much time trying to understand the system from everybody's perspective in the room together is that if we documented it, hopefully we could use this as a foundation for thinking about how to build resilience in the system. Okay, so I'm almost done. I just want to show you what this looks like. So what we did was we started with some of the dynamics, some of the stories about what leads to what, that the group felt was really important to capture, and then layered it all together. So these diagrams, these causal loop diagrams, gave us a way to capture this data about the system structure that could lead to violence transmitting, becoming more violence. So the story goes, again, it's the same way to read this, a little different than what I showed you before. Fear of criminals can lead to isolation, an increase in isolation, which leads to a decrease in mental health, also respect for others, which together can increase the chances of perpetration of violence, which can increase the chances of becoming a direct victim of violence, further reinforces this fear of criminals. So it's another story about how violence can beget violence. All of this needs to be tested, but they went to layer on here. So this fear of violence leads to taking individual protective measures, owning a gun, okay? And in combination with the routinization and normalization of fear and violence in the community can be a really dangerous combination for really increasing norms of gun ownership in the community, norms of aggression and power. And if that's the outlet for expressing, claiming power, it's a really potentially dangerous one that can lead to more violence. But there are, thankfully, other ways that we can help people reclaim their power after having been victimized. And then they went on. The diagramming continues, and this starts to get complicated, but when you're in that room, part of documenting your story this way, it can be a really rich way to capture this hypothesis about the system structure and test it against all of the hypotheses we all carry around in our heads. I'm not going to go through this all, but we really started talking about how norms of gun ownership can lead to negative views from the external community, lead to racism or this othering. These people are different from us, which can lead to decreased job availability, housing, can also lead to inequitable policies, which increase the rate of incarceration, which can increase trust, or decrease trust in the system and lead to an increase in taking matters in one's own hands. A lot of these dynamics might be what's underpinning some of this growth and violence that we see. And if we can understand it in more detail, the ripple effects, we can try to figure out how to build resilience in the system. And again, let me reiterate, this is just another way to capture data. This needs to be tested. It needs to be compared to other data that we can get. But I would strongly suggest that we think about collecting data like this to throw in the mix. So that's where I'll end. This is just my slide for how I think that engaging in modeling like this can really help us go from what we typically do in collectives to what we should be doing. But I'll close with this slide.